New York has always looked like a city run by mayors, governors, and Wall Street CEOs. But what if the real power brokers were never in the spotlight? What if the decisions that shape neighborhoods, unions, and billion-dollar industries were actually made behind closed doors by men who didn't appear on any official list of leaders? Viewers don't understand how deeply the five families influenced New York not just through crime, but through politics, economics, and social power structures. This video solves that by exposing how real power worked and how much of the city's history was built by people no one voted for. Welcome to today's documentary. In this episode, we're diving into a side of New York City that rarely makes it into textbooks, the hidden machinery of the five families, the Underworld dynasties, that quietly shaped the city's power structure for nearly a century. Forget the movie myths, this is the real story of how they operated as shadow governments, power brokers, and kingmakers. When people talk about New York's power structure, they picture the mayor, the governor, city planners, Wall Street executives, and the corporate giants who fuel the economy. But what most people never realized is that, for decades, the most influential force in the city didn't hold elected offices, didn't appear in newspapers, and certainly didn't operate out in the open. The true influence came from a network working behind the curtain, the five families who shaped New York not just through fear, but through strategy, structure, and silent control over the city's most essential systems. It didn't start with violence. That part came later. The real foundation of their power began with understanding something simple. New York thrives because of its infrastructure. Every building that rises, every truck that delivers goods, every piece of garbage removed from the streets, every union negotiation that keeps the city running, these are the arteries of the city. And the moment the families realized how deeply these systems affected the daily life of millions, they moved from being street-level gangs to becoming architects of influence. They figured out early that if you control the labor, the contracts, and the flow of money, you control the city without ever stepping into City Hall. They began infiltrating unions, not to destroy them, but to quietly guide them. A union president wasn't just a figurehead. He was the gatekeeper to who got jobs, which companies won bids, and which projects moved forward. If a construction firm wanted to operate, they needed labor. And labor could be slowed down, sped up, or completely blocked with a single phone call from the right person. Suddenly, construction delays weren't just accidents. They became bargaining chips, leverage points, tools that shifted millions of dollars in or out of certain pockets. This wasn't random pressure, it was calculated influence. The families also understood the political landscape better than many politicians did. They didn't need public approval, they needed access. If a candidate showed promise, they found ways to help campaign funding through intermediaries, voter mobilization in key neighborhoods, quiet endorsements delivered through community channels. And when a politician won, the families didn't demand the spotlight. They simply expected cooperation, a call returned, a favor honored. What made their political influence so powerful wasn't intimidation, it was their ability to make things happen quickly in a city famous for bureaucratic delays. A zoning issue, a permit approval, a union problem, a stalled project, these became opportunities to demonstrate usefulness. But their reach didn't stop with politics. They extended their influence to industries that quietly controlled the city's rhythm. The garbage industry wasn't glamorous, yet it generated billions. Trucking wasn't in headlines, yet without trucks, the city starved. Ports weren't tourist attractions, yet everything imported flowed through them. Every one of these industries became a pillar of economic power for the five families. And when you controlled the industries that businesses relied on, businesses became partners, sometimes willingly, sometimes reluctantly, but always inevitably. This wasn't accidental. It was a long game. Every handshake was strategic, every alliance was intentional, and every piece of influence was built layer by layer. Over decades, the five families positioned themselves not as criminals lurking on the outskirts, but as the unseen backbone of New York's economic and political machinery. They didn't replace the government. They simply became the system behind the system, guiding decisions, shaping industries, and quietly determining the direction of a city that believed it was being run from the top down, never realizing how much of the real control lived in the shadows, behind the scenes. To understand the true reach of the five families, you have to step outside the world of organized crime and into the world of legitimate power banks, political offices, union headquarters, real estate boards, and corporate backrooms. Because the families didn't rise by standing alone. They rose by forming alliances with people who operated in suits instead of leather jackets, people whose names appeared on office doors instead of arrest sheets. And these alliances weren't just convenient partnerships. They were the lifeblood of the Underworld's transformation into something far more sophisticated. Most people imagine the mob dealing strictly with criminals. But the truth is that mob bosses relied on a network of professionals who never once set foot in a social club. Lawyers, accountants, bankers, consultants, brokers, union officials, mid-level politicians, each of them held a piece of access the families needed. And the arrangement was simple. In exchange for loyalty, silence, or cooperation, these legitimate figures received protection, steady business, financial opportunities, or political stability engineered behind the scenes. The first group to form deep alliances with the families were businessmen, especially those in construction and transportation. These industries weren't optional. They were the backbone of New York's growth. Companies that wanted to win contracts had to navigate a maze of unions, inspectors, licensing boards, and political relationships. The five families became a shortcut through that maze. If you needed labor, they delivered. If you needed delays removed, they handled it. If you needed a competitor slowed down just enough for your bid to win, they made sure the timing aligned perfectly. And they didn't always use violence. Sometimes all it took was a quiet conversation with the right person at the right moment. Then came the politicians. They weren't co-conspirators. They were beneficiaries. The families didn't need politicians who were corrupt, just politicians who were busy. Think about a candidate running for office. They need votes, funding, volunteers, and influence in key neighborhoods. The families could mobilize thousands of voters with a whisper. They could guarantee campaign donations through friendly donors. They could open doors to community leaders or close them permanently. And politicians understood something unspoken. Alliances with the families weren't about doing crime. They were about smoothing obstacles. A problem disappeared here, a permit got approved there, a union dispute dissolved overnight. Soon, politicians realized they were dealing with people who could accomplish in 24 hours what bureaucracy couldn't do in 6 months. But the most surprising alliances were with people in finance. Mob money needed to look clean and banks needed deposits. A loan officer who turned a blind eye or a manager who asked fewer questions became invaluable. Shell companies were opened, fake invoices generated, cash businesses flourished. And through this financial ecosystem, billions were washed into legitimacy. Those who helped weren't gangsters, they were professionals who saw opportunity and took it. These alliances were never written down, no contracts. No signatures, no agreements on paper. They lived in trust, favors, and quiet understandings. A banker introduced to a capo became a long-term asset. A lawyer who won a case became a permanent ally. A union leader who cooperated once found himself elevated, protected, supported in ways no rival could compete with. As these alliances grew, something remarkable happened. The five families stopped being outsiders looking in. They became participants in the city's most respected systems, shaping them, benefiting from them, and sometimes even stabilizing them. The real estate market, ports, nightlife, transportation routes, political outcomes all were influenced not through brute force, but through partnerships with people the public considered respectable. And that blurred line between the underworld and the legitimate world became one of the most powerful weapons the families ever possessed. If you really want to understand how the five families became more than neighborhood gangs, you have to follow the money because their power didn't come from street crime. It came from building invisible financial pipelines that ran underneath New York City like secret rivers, carrying billions of dollars through industries most people never think twice about. These weren't small-time operations. These were complex networks designed to move cash, hide profits, and turn illegal earnings into legitimate income that could flow through banks, corporations, and political channels without raising alarms. It began with cash businesses, restaurants, nightclubs, parking lots, vending machines, car services, even small storefront operations. These places generated a constant stream of untraceable money. But the families knew that cash alone wasn't enough. To grow, they needed industries that could absorb massive amounts of revenue without scrutiny, industries where inflated costs, fake invoices, and padded contracts were considered normal, and New York had plenty of them. Construction was the crown jewel. No city in America built more, demolished more, rebuilt faster, and expanded more aggressively than New York. Every project, whether it was a skyscraper, a school, a bridge, or a residential building, required contractors, suppliers, unions, inspectors, and logistics. And every step offered opportunities to move money. A concrete supplier could overcharge by 20%. A trucking company could bill for extra trips that never happened. A debris removal crew could claim additional labor hours. All of it looked legitimate on paper. But behind the scenes, a portion of that inflated cost flowed straight back to the families. Then came trash and sanitation, a business nobody admired but everyone depended on. The private carting industry was the perfect vehicle for hidden earnings. Companies paid protection fees, disguised as service costs. Competing haulers were pushed out or absorbed. Routes were assigned and controlled like territories. And because garbage collection wasn't optional for businesses, the monthly payments became predictable, steady, and nearly impossible for investigators to separate from real operating expenses. Another pillar of these secret financial pipelines was the trucking industry. Everything that entered the city, from food to raw materials to manufactured goods, came through trucks. And with control over unions, loading docks, and distribution centers, the families could charge fees without ever appearing in the transaction. A small delay here, a lost shipment there, a union dispute that magically resolved after payment companies learned quickly that cooperation was cheaper than resistance, and every delay or favor created a new revenue stream. Ports and waterfront operations expanded these opportunities even further. Cargo crates held everything from electronics to clothing to luxury goods. A rerouted container, a shaved weight record, a manipulated manifest. These small adjustments added up to millions every year. Dock workers who played along were rewarded. Those who didn't quickly found themselves reassigned, threatened, or quietly retired. The waterfront became a financial engine, with money flowing in so many directions that auditors couldn't track it. But the most impressive part wasn't how the families made money, it was how they hid it. Layers of shell companies were created, each appearing legitimate, each owned by someone with no obvious connection to the underworld. Bookkeepers prepared spotless financial records. Lawyers structured deals to avoid suspicion. Legitimate businessmen partnered with mob-linked companies without fully understanding the depth of the partnership. And when funds finally entered the banking system, they looked clean, taxed, and completely legal. These financial pipelines allowed the five families to operate like corporations. They reinvested in businesses, purchased real estate, funded political campaigns through intermediaries, and built wealth that didn't disappear even when individual members were arrested. Money didn't just fund their operations, it protected them, expanded their reach, and made them indispensable to industries that relied on the very pipelines the families controlled. What made the five families so powerful wasn't just their influence over unions, industries, and politicians, it was the meticulous internal structure that kept their world functioning like a silent corporation. To outsiders, the mob looked chaotic, driven by violence, ego, and personal grudges. But inside, the families operated with rules more rigid than many legitimate organizations. They had councils, codes, communication lines, and governing bodies that controlled every move. And these weren't optional traditions. They were the backbone of an empire that survived for nearly a century. At the heart of this structure was a coded, unspoken, but universally understood set of principles that every member lived by. It dictated loyalty, silence, discipline, and judgment. Breaking that code meant consequences that no court could overturn. Keeping it meant safety, respect, and a path upward in the hierarchy. Every soldier knew who to answer to. Every capo knew the limits of his territory. Every underboss knew what decisions he could make without approval. And every boss understood that even he wasn't above the system, because above all the families sat something greater, the commission. The commission wasn't just a meeting of powerful men. It was the ultimate governing council of the American Mafia, created to stop wars and organize territories. It evolved into a decision-making board that rivaled corporate boards in complexity. No major action, no hit on a boss, no expansion into new industries, no partnership with outside groups was taken without commission approval. These meetings were rare, secretive, and heavily protected. But when they happened, the outcomes shaped the entire underworld. One decision could redirect millions of dollars, shift the balance of power, or erase a problem before the outside world even knew it existed. Inside individual families, the chain of command was just as clear. The boss sat at the top as the CEO, but he wasn't a dictator. He relied on advisors, trusted lieutenants, and his underboss, who often acted as the day-to-day manager. Capos oversaw crews like department heads, each responsible for their own revenue streams, networks, and men. Soldiers were the workforce, the ones who collected money, enforced rules, ran operations, and maintained relationships on the street. Everyone had a role, and everyone understood the boundaries of their authority. What made this system so effective was its discipline. No one acted alone. A soldier couldn't authorize a hit. A capo couldn't make a political alliance. Even an underboss couldn't expand territory without clearance. Everything flowed upward through the hierarchy until it reached someone with the authority to act. And this wasn't done out of fear. The system existed to avoid chaos, prevent rogue decisions, and protect the organization from unnecessary exposure. Communication was another controlled element. Conversations were kept face-to-face, not on phones. Messages were delivered through trusted intermediaries. Sensitive topics were discussed only in secure environments, clubs, basements, secluded restaurants, places where listening devices were difficult to plant. Each family had protocols for handling law enforcement pressure, media attention, and internal conflicts. Nothing was left to chance. Even disputes were managed strategically. If two capos clashed, the underboss handled it. If two families had tensions, their bosses or representatives met privately to negotiate solutions. Violence was a last resort, not a first instinct. Too much heat meant too much attention, and attention was the enemy of long-term power. The organization thrived, not because it was ruthless, but because it was controlled, calculated, and bound by traditions that ensured stability even when leaders changed or crises erupted. This internal structure allowed the five families to move as one coherent force even when rivalries existed. Decisions weren't random. They weren't emotional. They were strategic choices filtered through layers of authority designed to protect the hierarchy and preserve the empire for the next generation, ensuring that the power behind the shadows always endured for decades. Law enforcement chased the five families the same way a person might swat at flies frantically, constantly, but without ever touching the hive. Investigators arrested low-level associates, disrupted individual operations, raided a few warehouses, and celebrated small victories. But the real machinery, the engine that powered the underworld's empire, continued to run untouched. And the question that has baffled historians ever since is simple: how did the authorities miss so much for so long? Part of the answer lies in perception. For years, the United States government refused to believe the Mafia even existed. Many politicians dismissed it as a myth, a fabrication, or a Hollywood exaggeration. Without acknowledging the existence of a nationwide criminal structure, law enforcement treated crimes as isolated incidents rather than threads of a larger, interconnected network. A truck hijacking in Brooklyn wasn't linked to a union dispute in Manhattan. A suspicious fire in Queens wasn't connected to a construction contract in the Bronx. Each crime was handled as a standalone case, which allowed the families to operate freely in the space between investigations. Then there was the problem of corruption, subtle, pervasive, and deeply rooted. Not every officer was corrupt, but enough were influenced, pressured, or compromised to create blind spots exactly where the families needed them. A detective who looked the other way, a judge who dismissed a case on a technicality, a prosecutor who mysteriously lost key evidence. These didn't happen by accident. They were strategic moves, engineered through favors, threats, or financial incentives. And in a city as enormous and complicated as New York, even a handful of compromised officials could derail entire investigations. But corruption wasn't the only obstacle. The families were experts at blending into legitimate industries. When a company won a construction bid, it wasn't listed under a mobster's name. When money flowed through trucking routes or garbage contracts, paperwork looked clean. When a union leader made a decision that benefited the families, it appeared to be a normal administrative move. Law enforcement was trained to chase criminals, not businessmen, politicians, or labor organizers. And that misunderstanding gave the families the perfect cover because the real power players wore suits, not leather jackets. The lack of coordination between agencies made things worse. Local police, state investigators, federal agents, each worked within their own silo, rarely sharing information quickly enough to connect the dots. A capo under surveillance by the NYPD might also be the subject of an FBI file, but the two sides never exchanged their findings until years later. The families exploited this fragmentation flawlessly. They understood that as long as agencies operated independently, no one could see the full structure of the empire. Technology was another disadvantage. Before wiretaps, hidden microphones, and long-range surveillance tools, most evidence relied on informants or catching criminals in the act. But the families lived by silence, loyalty, and coded conversations. Meetings were held in places where microphones couldn't be planted. Sensitive discussions took place while walking outside, moving constantly, far from walls or tables where bugs could be hidden. Investigators would sit outside social clubs for hours, watching men enter and exit without ever learning what was being discussed behind closed doors. And perhaps the most overlooked factor was fear not of violence, but of consequences. Speaking against the families didn't just endanger the informant. It endangered their family, their job, their reputation, and sometimes entire communities. Witnesses disappeared, changed their stories, or refused to testify. Juries were intimidated. Cases fell apart before they even reached trial. Prosecutors knew that bringing the wrong case without enough evidence could result in failure that would discourage future efforts. It wasn't until the introduction of RICO laws, modern surveillance, task force cooperation, and a wave of high-profile informants that the full scale of the Mafia's influence became visible. But by then, the five families had already spent decades building their networks, embedding themselves in the city's structure, and mastering the art of operating right under the government's nose. When people hear the names of the five families today, they imagine relics of the past, grainy black and white photos, smoky back rooms, old crime stories that belong in history books. But the truth is far more complicated. The official power of the families may have weakened, but the imprint they left on New York didn't vanish. It fused with the city's systems, seeped into its industries, and shaped the way business, politics, and labor operate to this day. You can tear down a building, you can remove a leader, but you can't easily erase the structures, habits, and networks that were built over generations. The most visible part of this legacy lies in New York's unions and labor landscape. For decades, the families controlled who got hired, how contracts were negotiated, and which companies thrived. While much of that over-influence has been reduced, the organizational habits they created still exist. The culture of back-channel agreements, unwritten rules, loyalty-based networks, and gatekeepers in key positions didn't disappear. They evolved. Decisions that once required approval from a capo now move through committees or private boardrooms. The faces changed, the titles changed, but the style of influence, the quiet negotiations, the strategic alliances, the pressure applied at the right moment still reflects an echo of the old system. Real estate carries an even deeper imprint. For decades, developers had to navigate a world where certain neighborhoods, unions, trucking routes, and contractors operated under invisible restrictions. That shaped how deals were structured, how permits were pursued, how construction timelines were planned. Even now, developers and contractors who never dealt with the Mafia directly still operate within a framework built during those years. Layered subcontractors, inflated costs, safety disputes, and political hurdles weren't born out of randomness, they grew out of decades of interference and control. And the ghost of that structure still influences the cost of building anything in New York. Nightlife and hospitality also carry traces of the old underworld approach. Not in the violent sense, but in the way networks function. Connections matter. Access determines momentum. Certain streets, venues, and industries still operate with a level of insider control that mirrors the older era. Business owners know that some deals happen quietly, some approvals take the right kind of conversation, and some neighborhoods move at a slower pace because of invisible hands guiding them. Politics hasn't escaped the legacy either. The families didn't just control the underworld, they learned how to influence elections, community leaders, local boards, and even judges. The methods they perfected: mobilizing neighborhoods, delivering blocks of voters, forming alliances with business interests, still exist in modern politics. Not as criminal acts, but as part of the city's political DNA. Campaigns still rely on power brokers who don't appear in public. Neighborhoods still respond to influential community figures who can deliver support with a single announcement. The families may no longer control these networks, but they built the blueprint that modern political operatives still use. Then there's the financial legacy. Shell companies, layered subcontracting, consulting firms with vague services. These concepts didn't originate with the Mafia, but the families mastered them long before they became common practice in the corporate world. Today, many industries use similar structures, not illegally, but because the system normalized complexity as a way to move money discreetly. The methods evolved into legitimate business strategies, but the roots can be traced back to the days when underworld accountants designed financial webs to hide illicit profits. Even law enforcement carries echoes of the old era. The creation of joint task forces, interagency communication systems, and new investigative techniques emerged because authorities had to adapt to the scale and sophistication of the five families. Modern investigations today, whether targeting organized crime, political corruption, or financial fraud, still use tools developed during the battles against the Mafia. What remains most striking is how deeply the families shaped the culture of influence in New York. There is still an understanding in the city that real power doesn't always sit in the spotlight. It moves behind the scenes, through relationships, favors, alliances, and quiet conversations that never make the news. The structure of the underworld may have fractured, but the city they molded still carries their imprint in ways that aren't always easy to see, yet are impossible to deny. When we look back at the five families, it's easy to focus on the headlines: the crime, the violence, the arrests, the courtroom battles that captivated the nation. But the real story runs much deeper. Their true power wasn't in intimidation or chaos. It was in their ability to understand New York better than anyone else. They learned how the city breathed, where its pressure points were, and how to pull the hidden levers that made everything move. They built alliances with businessmen who wanted shortcuts, politicians who needed help, and union leaders who understood the value of cooperation. They created financial pipelines that blended illegal money with legitimate industries so seamlessly that even experts couldn't untangle them. They built internal systems more disciplined than many corporations, governed by councils and codes designed to keep order where chaos should have ruled. And for decades, law enforcement struggled to grasp the sheer size of the machine operating in the background. Even today, long after their influence has faded from the headlines, the echoes remain. You can still feel it in the way deals are made, in the structure of unions, in the layers of real estate negotiations, in the quiet backchannels of politics. New York's story can be told without acknowledging the shadow government that shaped its evolution. An empire built not in towers or boardrooms, but in the unseen layers of power beneath the surface. And ultimately, that's the real secret of the five families. They didn't just control a city, they understood it. They read its weaknesses, exploited its opportunities, and embedded themselves so deeply that parts of their legacy still live on in the systems we consider normal today. The five families may no longer dominate New York the way they once did, but their fingerprints remain on the blueprint of the city's power, subtle, quiet, and impossible to fully erase.